Now we're in Flagstaff at Northern Arizona University as we continue our 100-city tour, heading on to Phoenix this afternoon and Tucson at the Convention Center tonight. I'm Amy Goodman, host of Democracy Now! Nermeen Sheikh is in New York with our guest, Yanis Varoufakis, the finance minister of Greece, who resigned over austerity. Nermeen?
I want to turn to Michael Fuchs, a senior member of German Chancellor Angela Merkel's CDU party. He was asked in February 2015 why the majority of Germans were opposed to giving money to Greece.
Well, it's a little bit the Greek government, and particularly Mr. Varoufakis, who came up with some wordings which were not really, in a way, somebody who is, well, who is in a demand, is need of money, and he should not handle our finance minister, neither our chancellor, like he did. So it was quite insulting our people, and that's one of the reasons the Germans are pretty upset about the situation.
That was a member of Angela Merkel's CDU party. So, Yanis Varoufakis, could you comment on what he said about your negotiating style and its impact on how the Germans saw the Greece debt crisis?
Well, by the way, there's no such thing as the Germans. You go to Germany, you get a variety of opinion. We began our Democracy in Europe movement with our comrades in Germany. Everywhere we go in Germany, we have immense support as a pan-European democratic movement. It is the German government that saw me as a major, major inconvenience. And you know what? They were very right to see me as a major inconvenience. And you know why I was extremely inconvenient? Because I didn't want any money. What I was saying to our electorate before the election, and that was the basis for my being elected, and what I was saying to the creditors after my election was very, very simple. The problem is not that Germany has not paid enough. Germany has paid too much in the case of the Greek bailout. We had the largest loan in human history. The question is, what happened to that money? It wasn't the money. It wasn't money for Greece. It was money for the banks. And the Greek people took on the largest loan in human history on behalf of German and French bankers under conditions that guaranteed that their income, our income in Greece, would shrink by 1/3. That is grapes of wrath, John Steinbeck material. 1/3 of national income disappeared. So it was impossible to repay that money. And they knew that in the first place. So the only reason why they effected this so-called bailout for Greece was to save their own banks and to present this as solidarity with Greece. And my simple line was this: we're not going to take another euro from the German taxpayers, from the hardworking people of Germany, of Slovakia, of France, until and unless we've stabilized our economy. And, let me put it this way. The German Swabian housewife, the Protestant ethic, what does it recommend? That if you're bankrupt, you should not borrow more money, right? So this is what I said. This is why I was extremely inconvenient, because I was utilizing the ethos and the morality of the Protestant ethic of the spirit of capitalism, according to Weber, and to the German traditions. And they couldn't believe it, that here was a Greek finance minister who was not asking for more loans. So I can understand why the gentleman was very upset with me.
91% of the bailout went to German and French banks?
Yes. Well, the first bailout. The first bailout. The second bailout, 100%. And the third bailout, which I didn't sign, Amy, it was 85 billion. Of that, precisely 0 will go to Greece. So these are just typical extend and pretend loans. What happened was very simple. In 2010, the Greek state went bankrupt because it was part of a common currency area, a monetary union, that was simply not fit to the purpose of sustaining the great financial collapse of Wall Street, the City of London, the Frankfurt banks, the French banks, and the Greek banks, and so on and so forth. So there was a cynical transfer of private sector, private bank losses onto the shoulders of the weakest of taxpayers, the Greeks, knowing that those shoulders were weak, so weak that they wouldn't be able to sustain that burden, and that burden would then be transferred to the shoulders of the German, the Slovak, the French taxpayers. And once they did this, it's like Shakespeare, it's like Macbeth. You commit one crime, then you have to commit a second crime to hide the fact that you committed the first one. And then a third one, and then a fourth one. And the second crime, of course, was a second bailout, because once the first bailout makes whole the bankers, then within a few months it becomes abundantly clear that the Greek state cannot sustain that loan. So a second predatory loan is enforced upon the Greek government in order to pretend that it is making its payments for the first loan, and then a third one, and then a fourth one. And the worst aspect of it is that these loans, which were not loans to Greece, were extended on condition of stringent austerity that shrunk our incomes. So we entered a debt deflationary cycle, a Great Depression with no end in sight, and the Great Depression which has absolutely no chance of a New Deal kind of solution like we had here in the United States in the 1930s, as long as the powers that be in Berlin, we heard the White House spokesman siding himself completely with Berlin, insist that this extending and pretending shall continue.
Yanis Varoufakis joins us today as the White House is backing calls for Greece to continue to implement widespread austerity measures following President Obama's meeting with German Chancellor Angela Merkel earlier this week. Greece and its international creditors are once again negotiating the terms of the bailout and the extent of the austerity measures creditors can impose. On Wednesday, White House spokesperson Josh Earnest told reporters the administration believes Greece must follow through on structural reforms.
Is there any concern within the White House about what appears to be an obvious deadlock between the creditors over the Greek debt situation and the International Monetary Fund?
I don't have any detailed knowledge of those ongoing discussions. Obviously, we're very supportive of the efforts that members of the EU have made to deal with the financial challenges posed by Greece's finances. Part of that agreement included Greece following through on a number of structural reforms, and we certainly believe that Greece has a responsibility to do that.
Earlier this week, negotiations between Greece and international creditors hit an impasse over the bankers' demands for extra austerity measures. The International Monetary Fund is demanding cutting Greek pensions and eliminating income tax exemptions if Greece does not hit its budget targets. It's the latest impasse in years of fierce political clashes between Greece and international creditors. For more, we're joined by a man who had a front-row seat to these battles, former Greek Finance Minister Yanis Varoufakis. He's been called the most interesting man in the world. He's also a professor of economic theory at the University of Athens and the author of more than 15 books, including most recently, And the Weak Suffer What They Must, Europe's Crisis and America's Economic Future.
Yanis Varoufakis' book takes a sweeping look at the history of the Eurozone, the creation of the euro, the construction of the European Central Bank, the lead up to the 2008 crisis, and what went so disastrously wrong in its wake. He served as the Greek finance minister from January 2015 to the following July as a member of the anti-austerity Syriza party, during which he helped lead Greece's battle against European central bankers and an historic referendum in which Greeks resoundingly voted down austerity. But only days after the no vote, Varoufakis resigned. At the time, he said, quote, "I shall wear the creditors' loathing with pride." Earlier this year, he launched a new pan-European umbrella organization called Democracy in Europe Movement 2025, or DM25. Yanis Varoufakis, welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. Can you respond to what's happened right now with Washington and Germany, President Obama's meeting with the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, calling for continued austerity in Greece? What exactly does this mean?
Well, it means that we have a stupendous case of the White House spokesman violating the Obama line. When we were elected in January of 2015, President Obama came out with a splendid statement. If I recall correctly, he said something along the lines that the principle of the greatest austerity for the most depressed of nations needs to be re-examined. He was opposing it. And now we have, yet again, this typical disconnect in the American administration. It's quite astonishing and saddening. On the one hand, the president is making all the right noises, and on the other hand, his spokesman comes out and supports cruel, self-defeating, irrational, inefficient, mind-blowingly inane austerity. And then allow me to correct the conventional wisdom peddled by the mainstream media. If you read or listen to all reports regarding the negotiations in inverted commas between Greece and its creditors, you will hear what we heard just before in your report, that the Greek government negotiations have stalled because supposedly Greece, the Greek government, Athens, is resisting structural reforms. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. The fact of the matter is that the Greek government last summer, in July of 2015, surrendered to the creditors. This is why I'm no longer the finance minister. And ever since, it governs by email. It is simply told what to do, and it's trying to do it. It is trying to implement it. The problem at the moment, the reason why we have yet another impasse, yet another delay in the announcement of the great reforms and fiscal policies that will be applied to the case of depressed Greece, is very simple. The International Monetary Fund and the German government are at loggerheads. That they are at each other's throats. They can't see eye to eye. The elephants in the room are tussling, and the little pipsqueak mouse, Greece, is being trampled upon. This is the truth. It's got nothing to do with the Greek government stalling on structural reforms. By the way, there are no structural reforms in question. Cutting down pensions is not a reform. It's like confusing butchery for surgery. It's not the same thing.
Well, earlier this month, I want to ask about the details of a discussion that WikiLeaks released precisely of IMF officials in charge of managing the Greek debt crisis, Paul Thompson, the head of the IMF's European department, and Delia Velculescu, the IMF mission chief for Greece. Could you talk about what was revealed in those discussions and what the significance is?
Well, exactly what I just said. If you read that dialogue, it's very clear. The IMF people are utterly frustrated with Germany. Why? Because the IMF, whatever one may accuse them of, and there is a lot to say about the IMF, at least they are numerate. They can add, subtract, they know arithmetic. And they know that the Greek debt is unsustainable. They know that the numbers that the European Commission on behalf of Germany is imposing upon Greece are numbers that will explode, they will fail. In 6 months' time, we'll have another failure of the program like we've had in the last 6 years. So the IMF wants to, the IMF, wherever it goes, it tries to impose what they refer to as internal devaluation. Devaluing labor, devaluing pensions, closing down small firms, small shops, pharmacies, and replacing them with supermarkets. That creates, liquidate, liquidate, liquidate. So that means, of course, a wholesome shrinkage in the economy, in the social economy. Now, that is their want. But at the same time, they're clever enough to know that when you shrink the national income and the social economy of a country like Greece, a program country, then you can't expect them to repay the gargantuan debt that has been accumulated. So they're like a quasi-numerate villain who wants to turn Greece into a desert, call it peace, and of course they understand that they have to cull the debt. The German government, on the other hand, and the European Commission that is acting on their behalf, simply do not want to talk about the debt because this would mean going to the federal parliament in Berlin and admitting that the loans for Greece, the so-called bailout loans for Greece, were not loans for Greece. They were loans, bailout loans, for German and French banks. And that money was never intended to come back to the German, to the Slovak, to the Portuguese taxpayers. It was always going to be money that was given from the taxpayers of Europe, initially from Greeks and then everybody else, to the French and the German bankers. So they refuse the IMF's calls for debt relief. And now the IMF, Washington, D.C., and Berlin are clashing, and they can't agree. And if you read this dialogue, it's spectacular. At some point they say, what will it take to get the Europeans, he means Berlin, to see that it's about time to cut the debt? And Paul Thompson's response is, we need an event. By that he meant another crisis, another bankruptcy, another spate of bank closures in Greece to concentrate the mind of Mrs. Merkel, who is named explicitly. So this story, this illusion, this soothing myth, soothing for the media, that the Greek government is resisting reforms, and this is why we have an impasse, has been completely and utterly exploded by the WikiLeaks exposure of these dialogues.
What is Ponzi austerity, Yanis Varoufakis?
Well, I mean, we all know what Ponzi growth is, right? What a Ponzi scheme is. It's when you pretend to be growing your income on the basis of unsustainable debt. And the more debt you take, the more you pretend that you're growing, but then you have to have even more unsustainable debt in order to maintain this illusion. Now, what is Ponzi austerity? Once these bubbles burst, the only way you can continue to pretend that you're solvent is through even more debt that will be utilized in order to repay or to pretend to repay the previous debts. And if you're going through a period of belt-tightening to impress creditors that you're doing the good Protestant thing, which is, you know, to be parsimonious and to tighten your belt, you have austerity, which continuously reduces national income, because when you reduce pensions, when you reduce investment, when you reduce all the determinants of aggregate demand, income of the nation shrinks. And you keep tightening that belt through more pension cuts, more reductions in public health and so on, and public education. And you keep on taking new unsustainable loans in order to pretend that you're not insolvent. That's Ponzi austerity for you.
Yanis Varoufakis, we're going to continue this conversation after break. Professor Varoufakis is the former finance minister of Greece, now teaching economic theory at the University of Athens. His new book is titled, "And the Weak Suffer What They Must: Europe's Crisis and America's Economic Future." We'll be back with him in a minute. I'm Amy Goodman. I'm in Flagstaff, Arizona, part of our 100-city tour at Northern Arizona University. Nermeen Sheikh is in New York in the studios with Yanis Varoufakis. He is the former finance minister of Greece who resigned over austerity. Nermeen?
So I want to ask now about one of the issues that you raise in the book, and also what brings Greece into the news more often now, which is the refugee crisis, an issue you also discuss in the book. You've spoken in particular about the Greek grandmother who's been welcoming refugees into her home in the village of Idomeni. She's an 82-year-old, and her name is Panagiotou Vasilidou. She was featured recently in a video by the UN's refugee agency, the UNHCR.
I have company in the house. I talk, we laugh, although we don't understand each other.
This grandmother also cooks for the refugees every day, and the children call her Mama. In this clip from last July, just over a week after you resigned, a Syrian migrant on the Greek island of Lesbos decried the conditions in the refugee camp in especially strong language.
We run from the death to the death. We find death at each step in our way. We ran from the death in our country to find death in the sea, and we ran from the death in the sea to find it here in the camp.
But at the time, the town officials said they were unable to address the situation, especially amid the country's financial turmoil. This is the mayor of Mytilene speaking last July.
It's as if the international community, the European Union, the Red Cross, the UN have given me a bomb to hold in my hands, and the fuse is burning very slowly, and I am desperately crying for help to blow out the fuse. But they are waiting for the bomb to explode before coming to our aid.
So, Yanis, can you talk about the refugee crisis in Greece and also the so-called hotspots, the registration centers for refugees there, which you've talked about?
Well, George Orwell would be very, very proud of Europe and our capacity for doublespeak and creating new terms by which to hide the awful reality. When you see the word hotspots, just translate it to concentration camps. It's very simple. The Greek government has been steadily pressurized by the European Union to effectively intern the refugees, instead of treating them like human beings in need of support, in need of food, in need of medicine, in need of psychological assistance. They are going to be treated, according to Brussels, as illegals, aliens that are going to be enclosed in those hotspots, concentration camps. And I have it on good authority from within the Greek government that the pressure is tremendous. The Greek government, which is, of course, fiscally completely and utterly impecunious, is being told the only way you are going to get money is if you intern them. So if you let them free and loose, even within Greece, you're getting not a penny in order to help feed them. So we have a magnificent array of NGOs and volunteers who are looking after the refugees. The Greek state is in a state of disarray because it just can't afford even to look after the Greeks who are suffering a long 7-year-long Great Depression. The Greek state is trying to do something, but is being pushed by Europe to treat inhumanely those refugees, but more generally. Look, this should not be a problem. Europe is large enough, it is rich enough. We should be able to handle this refugee crisis humanely, efficiently, without this even being something we discuss. So let me remind our audience something that most people have forgotten. When the Iron Curtain came down in 1991, Greece, which was never a rich country, a country of 10 million people, we accepted 1 million refugees within a few months. Half of Albania moved to Greece. Do you know what happened? Nothing. It was all fine. They still live there. Their kids come to the university where I teach. They're amongst my best students. Greece has become enriched. Our culture has become stronger. Our food has become even better. And if a small lower middle income country like Greece can accept a 10% influx of refugees in a few months and do quite well out of it and actually be stronger as a result of that, Europe, which is aging pathetically, should accept these refugees, like Angela Merkel initially said in September, October, until she was vetoed by her own party and her own supporters. So what we have is the European Union is disintegrating under its postmodern 1930s. This is what we've been experiencing the last 10 years due to the economic crisis. The foundations...
I wanted to ask you, Yanis Varoufakis, is Greece being used as an example by Germany, kind of warning to France?
Oh, in the economic realm, there's absolutely no doubt about that. Amy, one of the wonderful aspects, few wonderful aspects of having served for 5-6 months sitting on that electric chair of the finance minister of Greece was that for the first time in my life I didn't have to theorize about these issues. I was told. German officials of the highest rank answered your question in the affirmative. They said to me explicitly, how can we let you off the hook when we want the Troika to go to Paris and to rein in the French national budget? So a proud nation like the Greeks is being used as collateral damage. Its misery is being used as a signal to France that it cannot have its cake and eat it. By that, what I mean. And the German elites have a point of sorts. The French elites always wanted to rule over Europe, to determine to be the administrators of Europe, using German monetary credibility to do so. And the Bundesbank and the German government wants to smack them for this. Unfortunately, they are smacking them by smacking Greece and pushing the Greek nation into an awful, frightful recession. Now, when Europe uses whole populations as instruments for the pursuit of 19th century-like power politics, you know that there is something deeply rotten in the Kingdom of Europe. And then when you add the refugee crisis on top of that, the centrifugal forces, the free-loading attitudes, the not in my backyard kind of mentality that the economic malaise and the economic conflict has caused, then transfers itself onto the realm of dealing with the refugees and treating them as a bad that needs to be thrown off one's backyard and onto somebody else's backyard. And the result is a complete loss of Europe's integrity and soul.
Well, Yanis, very quickly before we conclude, you've talked about the rise of right-wing parties and Greece, Golden Dawn in particular, as becoming worse as the economic crisis worsened. So could you talk about the impact of Golden Dawn and its recent expanding power?
It's not just Golden Dawn, it's everywhere in Europe. We have a neo-fascist government in Hungary. We have Marine Le Pen, who is going to top the presidential race next year in France. I mean, you just have to state this to panic. You have UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party in Britain. You've got Austria in Vienna, the beautiful city of Vienna. 42% voted for a neo-fascist party in the last municipal election and last week. In the
we have 30 seconds, so quick, please.
It's very simple. Great Depression, national humiliation, put them together, like in the 1920s and 30s in Germany, and you end up with the serpent's egg hatching.
Yanis Varoufakis, before we end, I do have to ask you a question about that song we played, Pulp, Common People. Was it about your wife? Can we settle this once and for all?
You may very well say this. I couldn't possibly comment.
Say that again.
You may very well say this, but I couldn't possibly comment.
Well, I thank you so much for being with us. Yanis Varoufakis, former finance minister of Greece, now professor of economic theory at the University of Athens. His new book, And the Weak Suffer What They Must, Europe's Crisis and America's Economic Future. And that does it for our show. We have job openings at Democracy Now!, internships as well as fellowships. Go to democracynow.org. Later today at noon, I'll be at Changing Hands on the 20th anniversary of Democracy Now! In Phoenix, in Tempe, and then on to Tucson, then to Grass Valley.
So I want to go to a short excerpt from your resignation statement last July, when you famously said, quote, "I shall wear the creditor's loathing with pride." In explaining your decision to leave, you wrote, quote, "Soon after the announcement of the referendum results, I was made aware of a certain preference by some Eurogroup participants and assorted partners for my absence from its meetings, an idea that the Prime Minister judged to be potentially helpful to him in reaching an agreement. For this reason, I am leaving the Ministry of Finance today." So could you talk more about the decision, your decision to resign from the government, and also why Prime Minister Tsipras decided to go against the will that was expressed in the referendum?
Well, it's a very sad affair. Let me put it this way. We were elected to say no to the creditors. No to what? Not to an agreement, to an honorable agreement, but no to the extending and pretending to the continuation of the depression. And the agreement that Tsipras and I had was that we were going to be steadfast in that no. We would compromise, but we will not be compromised on this. We will not give the debt deflationary Great Depression cycle another spin. And we had agreed amongst ourselves that if the pressure gets too much, we may even have to resign. But we are not going to be the ones that sign on the dotted line of yet another deepening magnification of our countries, of our people's misery and depression. At some point, the creditors, it became spectacularly clear that they were only interested in a coup d'etat, in overthrowing our government. In 1967, we had a coup d'etat in Greece using the tanks. Now we had a coup d'etat using the banks. They closed down the banks to asphyxiate our government. And we put it to the Greek people. We said to them, this is the ultimatum that we're being given. You decide yes or no. We recommend no, but if you say yes, then we will make way for a surrender. By the way, I didn't expect them to say no, because they were being terrorized on a daily basis by the media, who were saying to them that if they dare vote no, then Armageddon will happen the next day. And their banks were closed. You had pensioners who had no access to their small bundle of savings. And yet, the magnificent Greek people on the Sunday of 5th of July gave us a resounding 62% no. Every constituency in the land, even constituencies that are right-wing and never voted for us, backed us. On that night, I was levitating with enthusiasm because the Greek people had energized us. My prime minister saw things differently. He said to me in his office that night, it's time to surrender. I spent 2 or 3 hours trying to dissuade him. I didn't manage it. He was the prime minister. I was just the finance minister. So I decided to resign and to go back to my apartment and script this letter of resignation. That letter was the hardest text I ever had to script. Because on the one hand, I had to register my total, utter, vertical opposition with the Prime Minister's decision to surrender. On the other hand, I didn't want to write a letter that clashed with my comrade and friend. And I phrased it in such a way as to say that the creditors clearly have an interest in my removal, which is perfectly understandable, because they were simply interested in overthrowing our government and our determination to say no to another extended pretend loan. The Prime Minister thinks he's going to get an agreement, and therefore I'm going to make his life easier by removing myself. Of course, there has been no agreement. What there has been is a complete and utter surrender, and a surrender document which will go down in European history as a very black spot on Europe's democracy. You only have to read the first page of it. It reads like a genuine surrender to an enemy document. And even as we speak, is it not true that even that surrender has not resulted in some kind of agreement? The IMF and Berlin are still at loggerheads on whether they should turn Greece into a stable desert or a constantly declining, miserable, depressed state. This is the difference of opinion between the creditors. And the Greek government, once it surrendered, it's simply watching the show of the two elephants tussling, waiting to be told whether we're going to be a desert or an economy in a permanent state of depression.
Well, an expression that you
Yanis
used...
Varoufakis, you talk about austerity as fiscal waterboarding. Explain.
Actually, it's fiscal waterboarding is something quite separate from austerity. Austerity is a self-defeating process. You cut government spending, you increase taxes in order to balance the government's books, but you fail. Why? Because, yes, you reduce government expenditure, the costs of running the government, but on the other hand, the economy shrinks, so tax take is also reduced, and therefore your books don't balance, and then you cut even more, and then national income shrinks even further, and then you have to cut even more, so it's a never-ending downward spiral. That's a problem with austerity. Fiscal waterboarding is something quite different. It's the predatory relationship, the coercive relationship between the creditors and the Greek government. In order to push the Greek government into even further austerity, in order to keep pretending that the original program works, what the creditors do is this. They have lent Greece a huge amount of money, and Greece has to make repayments every month, every year, the Greek state. Of course, the Greek state is bankrupt, it cannot make these repayments. So it has to keep borrowing from the creditors to be giving money back to the creditors every month, every second month, to pretend that it is ahead of its repayment schedule. But the creditors, every second month, every third month, bring the Greek state to the state of asphyxiation by refusing the loans which are necessary for the Greek state to repay them, so that the Greek state is not declared to be in default. So they bring the Greek state to the verge of not being able to pay pensions, of not being able to pay the electricity bill in schools, and then, or to have to default to the IMF, to the European Central Bank. Then they, at the last moment, this is waterboarding, isn't it? What is waterboarding? You subject the subject to a process of asphyxiation, and just before death comes, you give the subject a gulp of oxygen, and then you repeat. This is precisely what they're doing. Instead of oxygen, it's liquidity, not to run the Greek state, but to keep giving your torturer the money back so that the torturer can carry on torturing you ad infinitum. That's fiscal waterboarding.
Well, I want to ask about something that you wrote about in your book, And the Weak Suffer What They Must, about the question of the impact of the financialization of the economy. You called the U.S. economy in the book a minotaur. So could you explain, first of all, what you mean by that, and how U.S. financialization helped lead to the 2008 crash, and whether anything has changed since, in your view?
Well, in brief, after the Second World War, the new dealers in power, initially the Roosevelt administration, then the Truman administration, then even the Eisenhower administration that accepted the New Deal principle, they designed a global system, a global financial and economic system, which was actually quite remarkable in its design, audacity, and rationality to a large extent. The idea was we dollarize the whole of the capitalist world. Maybe in Britain they have pounds, in France they have francs, but they are all linked to the dollar. The dollar is the currency of capitalism. And in addition to that, you have the surplus country of the time, which was, of course, the United States of America, taking part of its surpluses and monetizing, dollarizing Europe and Japan, helping them out, not out of philanthropy, but because they understood that unless you take surpluses from where they're produced, to give them to channel them, to funnel them to the deficit regions, to create the incomes which are necessary to keep buying American goods in order to maintain and replenish and recycle the American surpluses, the whole system will no longer be sustainable. But that system ended with a famous Nixon shock of the 15th of August 1971. Why? Not because Nixon made a mistake, but because America lost its surpluses. So you can't recycle surpluses if you don't have them. And then we moved to the second phase of post-war global US hegemony, which was exactly the opposite of the first. Instead of recycling its own surpluses, America didn't have surpluses, it was recycling other people's surpluses. And how did it do it? By means of the United States trade deficit. The trade deficit of the United States, which was ever expanding, operated as a huge vacuum cleaner that was sucking into the United States the net exports of Japan, of Germany, later China, of Saudi Arabia, oil, and so on and so forth. And how was it paying for it? How can you keep expanding your deficit? Well, if you are the United States, you can, as long as you create circumstances that attract the profits of the German firms, the Japanese firms, the Saudis, the Chinese firms into Wall Street, and you close the circle. But what happens when you give Wall Street a few $billion every 10 minutes to play with? They create instruments, financial derivatives and all those beautiful toys of financialization to make it really expand exponentially and to print their own money in a sense. That's financialization. And as long as that worked to stabilize a very unstable global capitalism, we had this semblance, this illusion. Remember the great moderation of Ben Bernanke? It was the most immoderate capitalist world you can imagine, but it seemed moderate because you had this recycling. You had capital flowing into Wall Street, constantly paying for the expanding trade deficit of the United States. But the pyramids of financialized money, private money minting, that started in Wall Street, combusted under the weight of their own hubris in 2008. And ever since, the global economy is in disarray.
Yanis Varoufakis, I wanted to turn to a clip of your conversation that you had this week at the New York Public Library, live at the NYPL, about the response of economists to the 2008 financial collapse.
Actually, one of the more interesting moments in the history of science and scholarship was actually in 2008. As you know, for decades, economists had been claiming with extreme arrogance that they completely understood how to control and manage an economy, There were fundamental principles like the efficient market hypothesis, rational expectations, and anyone who didn't accept this was dismissed as a kind of some strange kind of moron. The whole system collapsed. The whole intellectual edifice collapsed in a most amazing fashion and had no effect on the profession.
None at all. Well, it did have. It had the effect that sometimes, you know, when we're driving on a freeway, and I usually go well above the speed limit, condemned if you will, and I get stopped by the police. For the next 20 minutes, I drive below the speed limit, but it doesn't last for more than 20 minutes. Then, after a while, I just go back to where I was. This is exactly like the economics profession. They had a brief moment of...
some did, but...
Some. Or at least of being a bit humble and staying, you know, keeping their heads under the parapet for a bit. But then within 20 minutes, they forgot about it and they carried on teaching the same rubbish to their students.
That's the former finance minister of Greece, Yanis Varoufakis, speaking with MIT professor emeritus Noam Chomsky earlier this week at the New York Public Library.